As I travelled round the edges of the empty quarter, I became more and more obsessed with the idea of crossing the sands.
I asked the herdsman in the foothills about the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. What is he talking about? What does he want? God alone knows. At last one of them exclaimed, "Oh, he means the sands." And I realized that this was their name for the great desert of southern Arabia.
Even round the edges of the empty quarter, the country is very desolate. You don't get any or very little cultivation, and the people themselves have had very little contact with the outside world. It isn't like northern Arabia, where the Arabs are in contact with Damascus and Baghdad and these other big towns. In southern Arabia, one desert really merges into another desert that's still more desolate. Even in the oases, there's very little cultivation. They have a few palm trees. But really the difference between them and the tribes that live in the empty quarter itself is that they're less nomadic. In consequence of this, I suppose they have more time to relax. For instance, the sheikhs have enough time to go out hawking, a thing which the Arabs in the empty quarter would never be able to do. They use peregrines and Seika falcons, which they catch in passage in the early winter. They carry them about the whole time on their wrists. And when they sleep at night, they have them on the block beside their heads. And when they're sitting in the sheikh's guest house, and there's a noise and shouting and talking going on the whole time, there are these hawks on their wrists, getting used to it. The Bedou are pretty self-sufficient, but they have to come in every now and again to the towns and villages. And then there's nothing they enjoy so much as watching a dance at the end of the fast of Ramadan or when there's a wedding. But what they really enjoy is when the sheikhs lay on a camel race. For it's camels which dominate the Bedou's life. They're absolutely obsessed by them. But it was only when I left the coastal villages and the settlements that I rarely met the nomads of the desert. The tribes among whom I traveled were the Rashid and the Awamar, and they moved about in small family groups to go off by themselves into the sands. Like all Arabs, the Bedou are very friendly people. It would be impossible to be lonely among them, but the price you pay for this is a complete lack of privacy. Compared with the women of the towns, the Bedou women have a great deal more freedom. It's obviously impossible to shut a woman up in a tent, or if you're living under a tree. Among the Bedou, only men or boys can milk camels. They never let the women do it. And before they milk a camel, they always wash their hands, even if it's only under another camel that's staling. Milk has tremendous importance to these people. It's their main diet. When they go off into the sands, they can be there for 6 months, living entirely on milk.
It was towards the end of his first year that Thesiger contacted the Bedou of the sands. He was now ready to attempt a crossing of the empty quarter.
I remember my excitement when I first met the Rashid. I realized at once that these were people quite different to the Beit Kathir. If anybody was going to be able to take me across the sands, they would be able to.
My companions were puzzled by my speech, but this did not stop them from asking questions about the Christians. Did they know God? Did they fast and pray? Were they circumcised? Did they marry like Muslims, or just take a woman when they wanted one? How much bride price did they pay? Did they own camels? Were they tribesmen? How did they bury their dead? When I first entered the sands, I was bewildered by the utter unfamiliarity of my surroundings, and frightened by the feeling that I had only to be separated from my companions, to be completely lost in a maze of dunes.
Traveling across the desert, if you come on a stray camel in milk, you have the right to milk it. This is accepted by all the Arabs. Similarly, if one of your party is riding on a bull camel, any encampment you come on has the right to demand that this bull camel should serve the female camels there, with sometimes very exhausting results for the poor old bull camel.
I had no desire to travel faster. In this way, there was time to notice things, time to collect a plant or look at a rock. The very slowness of our march diminished its monotony. I thought how boring it would be to rush about this country in a motor car.
It's extraordinary that in the desert, even half an hour's rain will bring up vegetation that will remain green for as long as 2 and sometimes 3 years. When you're looking around for a place to camp, the first consideration is if there's any grazing for the animals. And after that, we try and find a dune or somewhere where we get a bit of shelter from the wind.
Here I was finding a freedom unobtainable in civilization, a life unhampered by possession, since everything that was not a necessity was an encumbrance. I had found, too, a comradeship inherent in the circumstances, and the belief that tranquility was to be found here.
In the sands, you very seldom have any difficulty about firewood, but out on the gravel plains which surround the sands, there's very often very little firewood. When we travelled in the desert, we were always hungry. We took with us a certain amount of rice, but we could only use this when we were on wells. Ordinarily, we made a sort of unleavened bread out of the flour. We also had some butter and some dried meat, and out of this we'd contrive some sort of a soup into which we'd dip the bread when it was ready. It was the sort of food which you only eat when you're very hungry. My companions sometimes played a game with camel droppings in the sand. It was very complicated, and I can never begin to understand what they were doing. But I suppose our main enjoyment was talking, and the only time that they'd ever stop was if somebody began to recite poetry, and then a hush would fall on the camp, and they'd gather round and listen to him.
وياك عيال العوازم عيال عطا هم قولهم صلبة عيال عطا عيال عطا ونعم والله بعيال العوازم يوم تحقون عينك كسروا الساعة مني عيال العيمال.
They were very self-sufficient. After all, they'd been leading this sort of life for centuries, and I found it was a mistake to try and introduce things from outside. The only thing which they rarely required were the rifles with which they fought. During all the years that I was with these people, I never had any apprehension that they would betray me. It would have been easy enough for them to have murdered me and dumped me in a sand dune and gone off with my possessions. And yet, the idea never crossed my mind. It was inconceivable. You get this intense loyalty to your travelling companions among the Bedou.
أنها مشت عيال عطا العوازم خلنا إياهم في دارهم هم في دارهم هم في دارهم الحين إن شاء الله نعطي الأيواد حقهم ما نظلمهم نعطيهم والله والضراء الغرب من يجونا هني مرة صوبة يجي كل واحد فرش غير يقول لا وكاد أنهم ما عينوا معزة هنا كل المعزة الدار دينهم عينوا معزة كل دار عينوا بها معزة كل دار مرة ما عينوا بها معزة السرع بالنامي كسروا ذول.
The others still talked around the fire, but I closed my mind to the meaning of their words, content to hear only the murmur of their voices, to watch their outlines sharp against the sky, happily conscious that they were there, and beyond them the camels to which we owed our lives.
In parts of the sand where we weren't afraid of raiders, we used to leave our camels out at night. They tended to drift for miles, always going towards their homelands.
It was a life that produced much that was noble, nothing that was gracious. A few years' relief from the anxiety of want was the most they ever hoped for. It seemed to me pathetically little, and yet I knew it was magnificently enough.
Only the women wear trousers. The men wear loincloths under their long shirts. And at first it isn't easy to keep yourself decently covered. I remember on one occasion, I was sitting in the sands, and a man turned to me in a rather stuffy voice, said, "Your nose." I thought I'd probably got a drip on the end of it. It was only then that I realized he was referring to quite another part of me. I'd never met a Bedou who was greedy, in spite of the hardship of their lives. When you've got meat, they always cast lots for it. This isn't because somebody's going to complain that he's been given too little, but because inevitably somebody will say that he's got more than the others. When they've been eating dates, they very often save a little for their camels, and then a man gets up and goes over and feeds it to his camels. It's incredible the way the Bedou can identify and read tracks. When I was near Mukshin, we were riding along and we saw some marks on the sand. And Sultan, one of the men with me, turned to another and said, "Whose tracks are those?" The man got off, looked at him for a while, crumbled up some camel dung in his hand, climbed back onto his camel and said, "6 Awama, they've come from the north. They've raided the Junaba on the southern sands. They've taken 3 camels, they watered at Salala, and they passed this way 6 days ago." We'd been 17 days without seeing Arabs. We went for another 23. And when eventually we met up with some, we heard the story of this raid, and the only thing we didn't already know was that they'd killed 3 of the Junaba. Wherever vegetations come up after rain, no matter how desolate an area, you find animals, sometimes gazelle or even oryx, and jerboas and hares and scorpions and lizards and snakes. A lot of snakes in the desert. I was always afraid when I went out at night to collect the camels that I might tread on one of them. The water in the sands was always brackish. Sometimes it was barely drinkable, except by camels. I can remember when we left our last well to go forth the water. The water was worse than usual. We had to mix it with milk in order to make it drinkable at all. And this is an unpleasant mixture the Bedou call shneen.
These men were cheerful and full of talk. The grazing was good. The camels, several in milk, would soon be fat. Life by their standards would be easy this year. But I thought of other years, when the exhausted scouts rode back to the wells to speak through blackened, bleeding lips of desolation in the sands, of emptiness, such as I myself had seen on the way back from Ghanim, when the withered plants were gone, and walking skeletons of men and beast sank down to die.
تلحقني بيده ولا خليت قدرت اقوم منه شبنتها كذي ما عداش عليها وصاك كثير ما يلطم ني قدرت اقوم منه شبنتها بي جوبك وانا مبين خلك الحول افلعن ابوك ريال الخليفه ابشر انك عثرت كسرت الحين نشهد على بالربزه العامري انه يسقي بعيرك من طول المده وانك مروح عطان قاع كبدك ومضروب يمك المغط وعند الريال اللي ما يستاهلون غير علمهم طيب وغان
When we were on the march or sitting around the campfires, my companions used to talk of raiding, hunting, and of camels and tribal politics. They were a vigorous race with strong passions, and their talk of sex was often vivid and frank, but I never found it obscene.
But during our journeys we seldom spoke of sex, for hungry men dream of food, not women, and our bodies were generally too tired to lust. Hour after hour, day after day, we moved forward, and nothing changed. The desert met the empty sky, always the same distance ahead of us. Time and space were one. Round us was a silence in which only the winds played, and a cleanness that was infinitely remote from the world of men.
Even with 4 companions, I was often overwhelmed by the emptiness and desolation of this desert. Luckily we had with us one of the best guides in Arabia.
Al-Auf, our guide, told me he had crossed the sands twice. The last time I came this way was 2 years ago, he said. I was coming from Abu Dhabi. Who was with you? I asked. And he answered, I was alone. Thinking I must have misunderstood him, I repeated, who were your companions? He replied, God was my companion.
If a man was bitten by a snake, he either lived or died. There wasn't very much they could do about it. We tended to divide all animals into what was religiously regarded as lawful or unlawful eating. Al-Auf used to maintain that the foxes which lived in the sands were lawful, whereas those that came off the gravel plains outside were unlawful. Then, of course, there were the jerboas, and these, if we could catch them, made an addition to our meal. Scorpions, of course, weren't. One night, I got stung twice by one, once in the neck and again in the hands. I put it up instinctively. It was less painful than years before when I was in Abyssinia, and I put one on inside my shorts. Lizards, on the other hand, were regarded as an acceptable addition to the diet. We used to spend quite a lot of time chasing them, trying to catch them. It's extraordinary what you'll eat if you're really hungry. Even when the Bedou is settled down and are preparing to eat, if they see a stranger, they make him welcome, once he's identified himself by throwing up sand into the air. We always treat a man in the distance as hostile. He then comes forward and greets the others with a triple nose kiss, after which he stands back. You then ask him, what is the news? Whatever it is, he answers, the news is good. You then take him over and sit him down and share your food with him. I remember on one occasion, we'd caught a hare. We had been a month without meat, and we were looking forward enormously to that hare. I looked up and saw 3 Arabs coming towards us. Seldom, as far as I'm concerned, can guests have been more unwelcome. According to Bedou custom, we fed them on our hare. I felt perfectly murderous. But the others seemed to find the pleasure of their company an adequate compensation for their lost meal.
We crouched over the fire as Bin Kabina made coffee. The sun had not risen yet. The chill wind whispered among the shadowy dunes and fingered us through our clothes and through the blankets which we wrapped about us. Formless things had now regained their shapes as the mist rose. We lingered for a moment more beside the fire. And then Alauf said, "Come." The grunting camels heaved themselves erect and moved forward. The gritty sand was cold as frozen snow. I stopped and watched the others, figures moving imperceptibly across Arabia. They could go on and on, I thought, until at last they come to Syria or Transjordan, and they would probably not pass a village or even a palm tree. And yet it is as far from here to Damascus as it is from the southern tip of India to the Himalayas.
الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أحدنا عن الشريك العظيم صالح
While the Bedou are very sensible of the beauty of their language, they are curiously blind to natural beauty. The color of the sands, the sunset, the moon reflected in the sea, such things leave them unmoved. Isn't that beautiful, I'd say. My companion would look uncomprehending. No, he'd say, it's rotten bad grazing.
Camels get very attached to their owners. I remember one in particular who would never be separated from him. He used to come round at night and sniff at him to make sure he was still there. If anybody else wanted to ride it, he had to take a bit of its owner's clothing with him and let the camel smell this before he got onto it.
It was very still with the silence we have driven from our world. I was reminded of what I'd often heard the Bedou say. It was only in the desert that a man could find freedom. Yet in the pitiless light of day, we were as insignificant as the beetles I watched laboring across the sands.
The big dunes in the center of the empty quarter are sometimes as high as 700 feet, and they run across your front for 100 miles and more. If you are tackling them from the steep side, that's to say the sheltered side, you need a very skillful guide to find your way up them. He has to follow the curves and twists, for most of the face is so steep It just comes avalanching down as soon as you tread on it. We had practically nothing to eat all this time. I can remember Alf saying once, we shall soon be too weak to get onto our camels. But it wasn't the hunger which worried me most, it was the thirst. We were rationed down to 1 pint of water a day, which we had at sunset. It was bitter, beastly stuff. But all the same, and I used to find myself longing through the day for the drink in the evening. 24 hours is a very long time to go without a drink. We used to start in the morning, and conversation died away. We just went on and on, the sun beating down on us, until it was time to stop.
Somewhere in the ultimate distance, the sands merged into the sky. But in that infinity of space, I could see no living thing, not even a withered plant to give me hope. There is nowhere to go, I thought.
Many people who've traveled in dangerous places have found comradeship among members of their own race. A few find it more easily, I think, among members of another race. The very differences which separate them, binding them more closely. I found it among the Bedou. Without it, I think these journeys would have been just a meaningless penance.
محمد يا رسول الله محمد يا رسول الله لا اله الا الله محمد يا رسول الله لا اله الا الله محمد يا رسول الله محمد يا رسول الله لا اله الا الله لا اله الا الله محمد يا رسول الله لا اله الا الله محمد يا رسول الله لا اله الا الله محمد يا رسول الله محمد يا رسول الله محمد يا رسول الله.
To others, my journey would have little importance. It would produce nothing but a rather inaccurate map, which no one was ever likely to use. It was a personal experience, and the reward had been a drink of clean, nearly tasteless water. I was content with that. Thesiger had crossed the empty quarter. It was the first of many journeys. Staying only a little time in the Weliwaء oasis, he returned across the stony deserts that lay west of the Oman mountains. Then a second, even longer crossing took him into the lands of the Murra and the Dawazir, where at one stage he was thrown into prison. 5 years after his arrival, his journeys were so numerous and so remarkable that he was now a legend among the Bedou. In 1950, he went to Dubai. His work for the Locust Research Center was nearly complete.
Here life still moved in time with the past. These people still valued leisure and courtesy in conversation.
It is now 16 years since Thesiger made his last journey into the empty quarter.
Today in Arabia, although I accept the inevitability of change, it has all come far too quickly. You see, now that no one wants their camels, the desert economy has collapsed. These Bedou, whose courage and skill enabled them to survive in the empty quarter, have to offer their services as unskilled labor.
The silence of the sands is broken now by the drilling rig, and the passing Bedou may look down on a new oasis, prefabricated, air-conditioned, and disposable.
Other people will go to Arabia, but they'll move about in cars and they'll keep in touch with the outside world by wireless. They'll bring back, I'm sure, results that are far more interesting than mine. But they will, I believe, never know the spirit of the land or the greatness of the Arab.